Good morning to you all. It's quite a privilege to kick off proceedings for what can only be described as a colossal conference. So we'll get started. Adam and I would like to talk about an aesthetic of restriction we adopt for our working practice together as music producers as part of the Night Ports project. And we want to talk about the implications of that aesthetic of restriction on our poetics, meaning the way that we go about making music. Crucially, at its root, this paper is going to address what I believe is one of the core themes of the conference, namely the relationship between practice and theory and back again. So in 2018, just 6 months ago, we released our album Night Ports with Matthew Bourne on the Leaf label. We worked with pianist Matthew Bourne to explore the characteristics of his playing, which on the one hand are chaotic and frenetic, but on the other hand he plays an extremely beautiful, lyrical and serene way. So we recorded him at his home just outside Keighley in Yorkshire, and then with 2 subsequent recording sessions at Besbroad Pianos in Leeds. The album features some 10, 11, 12 pianos which in age span about 200 years, and each one was in a different stage of decay, and each piano had a very different musical story to tell. This album is the exploration of his playing, his response to those instruments. So what I think we should do is just play you a couple of extracts from the first track. The first thing you will hear is a Japanese Toyama grand piano from 2010, and then we'll skip ahead and you'll hear some futurist rhythmic clanking made by a piano dating from about 1854. Can we sit up? Yeah. Thanks, Abby. Is that volume level okay? Into the break where it just does the intro material again. So importantly, the album presents the illusion of Matthew playing these tracks, improvising spontaneously, in the moment, in the space, in response to those instruments. But this music never existed. This album, like all other recorded music, is a complete illusion, an edifice. It is hyperreal. And it's a quality that we never try to hide. It's a quality that we exploit and explore at all points. As Evan Eisenberg says, a recording records nothing. It is like the composite photograph of a minotaur. The album, like all of our works as Night Ports, is governed by a manifesto, and it's this self-imposed restriction that is the subject of our paper today, which we'll explain and explore by introducing some of the situating concepts that might be related to our practical work, and also we'll explain some of our practical work, not as a how-to, but to offer an insight into the way that we work with sound and some of the implications of working with sound when we impose such a limitation.
So I'll introduce you to the manifesto. All good bands have manifestos, that's the rule. So Night Ports is based on a simple but unbreakable rule of restriction. Only sounds produced by the featured musician can be used, nothing else. But these sounds can be transformed, distorted, changed slide, translated, reworked, processed and reprocessed, stretched, cut, ordered and reordered. Night Ports is about amplifying the characteristics of the musician and their sounds. It's about finding new sounds that nobody else can make. So with this manifesto, we'll give you a quick oversight as to how a project typically works, and then we'll go into details of what happens along the way. So we begin by working with an improvising musician in a specific place. We all meet up and we just let them crack on. We record as much as we can in the day with some guidance, which we'll talk about later, and basically harvest sound. From this, we then go away into a lab kind of environment and take anything we find is interesting to make the most amount of material we can. We then curate that material and begin to think what can happen to this if we take it this way, where can we move this material to? And then begins the process of effectively recomposition, where we take the improvised lines and parts and then we work on them as new, with that as the initial stimulus. Following that, we then share and review our work with the musician and see if they want to play over it, which is still within the remit of the manifesto, or whether they are happy to let it go.
So, we've done 2 albums now, and we're working on our next 3. So we've got 5 substantial bodies of work already in progress. And recently we changed focus. We moved away from working with musicians to working with places. So a couple of weeks ago, as part of Leeds Beer Week, we recorded the sounds of our own beer, a night porter, it's all about a pun, being brewed, and we performed a 20-minute set using only sounds that were made during the brewing of that beer. So we're taking this manifesto into slightly different context and drinking a lot of beer along the way. So we need to try and situate what it is we're doing. An underlying and ever-present question is, why would you adopt such a manifesto? One simple answer is that in the very early days, we wanted to make music collaboratively together in a counterpoint to the academic projects that we were working in. And I'm under no illusion that our work in the higher education sector certainly feeds into that kind of philosophically driven approach to making music. Another simple answer is that we were simply in pursuit of an individual sound, and we achieved that by striving for an individual sound source. So the relationship between the source and the sound. But there are more complex answers to this question of why we would adopt the manifesto. And that brings us into contact with a couple of important situating concepts, which we'll set out now as a way of framing the rest of the talk. The first of these is that our project is undeniably afforded by the technological tools that we have available. Not only do we use these tools, but those tools leave very specific effects. Digital technologies allow sound to be manipulated in continually unprecedented ways, which can be understood as quantity, speed, and granularity of intervention. For example, we can perform an unlimited number of time-based edits on a tiny slice of audio. We can do it very quickly and at a level of magnification which is virtually atomic. Our work is very much atomic in nature, and it's at that level that we exert the majority of our control as producers over the resulting sound. Brevik Hansen and Danielson's excellent 2016 book traces the impact of technologies on the resulting sound. So our manifesto is adopted as a means of navigating the impossibly infinite number of possibilities allowed by contemporary music technologies. But we're also interested in the traces that those technologies leave on our sounds. That's an important factor of how and why we use technology.
The second key issue is about improvisation and recording. So our manifesto is about restriction, and it implies technological restrictions. But this brings about the idea of a social collaboration, of a specific musician being recorded at a point in time and a spontaneous act that's then captured. Recording, however, as a process, initially seems to contradict the desire to explore what an improvising musician can do and is capable of, because the sound becomes fixed. Schnabel coins the term deconstruction by preservation as a way to attack the ability and function of recording to undermine the vitality of improvisation. In the Nightports project, and in what we do, however, we see the recording, or the moment of preserving spontaneity as the means of an ongoing fluid set of actions that can emerge from that capture. Fixing the performance in time and space is just one step in the process of what can be fluid and dynamic from there on. Underpinning all of this is the idea of recording as representation, or as allowing for interpretation. So whilst we can capture a recording in a way that a photograph could capture a scene, we can also choose to take it into, as Mark discussed, the hyper-real and the further abstracted as we go through the process.
So, as I mentioned at the start, these recordings never existed, and this music, well, the recordings do, but the music never existed. It was never played and never can be played, although we have tried quite recently with 3 pianos and live electronics, and we'll be doing a bit more of that in the future. Just as Baudrillard asserts that the simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth, that there is no truth, we never conceal the nature of our construction as construction. To adopt Moorfield's term, our music self-consciously bathes in the reality of illusion, and sometimes we play with the illusion of reality. I'm going to play you a short clip from our track Window, which is the first one we ever made with Matthew. And even though it appears to just be a pianist improvising a very straightforward line, on detailed inspection it becomes obvious, well I hope it becomes obvious, that it's an impossible combination of spaces through reverb, and it's an impossible combination of technique. You couldn't actually play this as a solo musician. So, restriction, limitation and creativity, it's certainly nothing new, and it's certainly not specific only to music as an art form. Probably most famously, Stravinsky talks about this in his Poetics of Music, and he talks about the terror that he experiences when he's confronted with the infinitude of possibilities. And he talks about how if nothing offers resistance, his creative work seems futile. He goes on to say that my freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. He also talks about the power of observation and accidents. Creativity goes hand in hand with the gift of observation. The true creator may be recognised by the ability always to find about them in the most commonest and humblest thing, items worthy of note. One does not contrive an accident, one observes it to draw inspiration therefrom.
This is the electronic musician Matthew Herbert and his personal contract for the composition of music, which is available on his website and has been through several iterations and changing drafts over the year. But this is effectively, and much longer than this, set of rules of what can and can't be done through this person's process. And at the start he says it's not necessarily a rule for the people, but this is his guiding principles. And for us, the bits that are of interest is the idea of, for one, self-limitation of source, but also this idea that you get through reading the rules that he places intrinsic value on where the sounds come from and what technologies are chosen. So as an example on number 4, no replication of traditional acoustic instruments is allowed where the financial and physical possibility of using the real ones exists. This implies someone that values the restriction they put on. Second example is from visual artist David Hockney, who says limitations are really good for you. They are a stimulant. If you were told to make a drawing of a tulip using 5 lines or one using 100, you'd have to be more inventive with the 5. So this idea of the creative and inventive possibilities of representation rather than documentation. Our next example of limitation is from film and the Dogma 95 manifesto, which was made between Danish directors Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg. And this is a certificate that basically was applied to films that met the criteria set out by the Dogma Manifesto. So directors could choose to do this, submit their film for review, and for us this certificate implies that there is a value to the people doing this, that they want that certification. The rules itself were largely an attempt to take back power to the director as an artist and to the actors as performers, and away from studios and things that were emerging, such as more advanced special effects. And here's a brief summary of their rules. Interestingly as well for us, the directors that began this, when they published a film or released it, they would also highlight the rules they'd broken. So one of them would say, I did use a lamp. Sorry, I used a lamp. And for us that's kind of good because it's the idea of using these rules until they become, you have to break them to get what you want. We haven't broke them yet, but Mark keeps trying. The last example is of New Nordic Food Manifesto, which was signed in 2004 by 10 chefs from the Scandinavian region, and it was basically a refocusing of the food culture of these parts. And there's a set of rules which include to express the purity, freshness, simplicity and ethics we wish to associate to our region, to base our cooking on ingredients and produce whose characteristics are particularly to our climates, landscapes and waters. So the idea became to refocus on what they had rather than what they could get. So the example we've used there of Noma, which won the best restaurant in the world 4 years in a row, restricts itself quite strictly to ingredients only from the Nordic region, and reinvented new techniques of dehydration and preserving and fermenting in order to achieve that limitation manifesting.
Yeah. So the manifesto, it does talk about sound source and that restriction, but fundamentally it's highly collaborative. It's a socially contingent structure which forces us to collaborate with particular musicians and explore what they do. So we're not just talking about sound itself, to borrow Anton Hennion's terms, prized away from its flesh and blood origin. We're talking about the sociality of working with people. We have a short 45-second video just giving you some glimpses of the kind of working processes we did with Matt. So, in our last 2 or 3 minutes, we just want to talk you through some of the things we do and offer some insight into the tools we use. What we've tried to do is categorise the 3 main types of intervention that we use. First, in the middle, is that we tend to try to preserve an audio source. That is, we give the sense that what you're hearing is what the musician played. This is a complete edifice, it's a complete trick, but it forms part of our sound world. Then either side of that, we tend to go towards that atomic mode of engaging with sound. So on the left-hand side, we fragment sound, sometimes having 10 or 20 edits in the space of a second. These are not edits that you can hear, but they give the effect of some kind of rupture, some kind of disruption has gone on. And it gives rise to a very fragmented, chopped up kind of sound. This might be loud. On the other side, we tend to use a software-driven approach. This fragmentation side is extremely laborious, it's manual, we do things with scissors on the screen. There's not very much software involved in that, if you like. On this side, we tend to use a range of kinds of software to extend sound using extreme time stretching so that these elements that normally go unheard in sound because they're so quick start to bubble to the surface. So we call this kind of an extension process. So we just hear those 2 piano notes stretched out. And then it's empty.
Okay, so we thought we'd share some of the tools we use in case any of you want to try any of this fun. I'll quickly go through and just mention what we use each for. So Logic Pro is the software we use that Mark does a lot of cutting, time switching, and the kind of the functions within the software can be quite, you can abuse them quite a lot, which is what we do. Glitch Lab is this thing up here, and it's a modular DAW processor where effectively you insert up to 6 loops, and then you can send them to lots of different effects units, and you can create new sounds from them. And it forces you to kind of play with sound rather than construct it. Pulse Stretch is this amazing looking thing here, blast from the 90s, and it allows for obscene levels of stretching audio. So a 3-minute track can end up being played back over 2 weeks. So if you do that with smaller audio, you can get new sounds out of it. So if you put a piano note in, you'll create a texture from it. This is Audio Mulch, and it's in a way similar to Glitch Lab. It allows you to create a way to send sound around lots of different things and then take it back. So with all of these programs, we effectively should put stuff in, see what it does, and then bring it all back in harvesting to Logic. And then the bottom, Generative 2 creates effectively sound pieces from little grains of sound. So if you import an audio file, it will automatically create a texture. FabFilter Saturn is a plugin that basically rearranges transients. So if you put in a drum loop, it will randomize it for you. Cecilia granulates things and stretches them out. Sound Toys is just a really fun bundle of plugins. If anyone's played with them, they suit their name, Sound Toys. And then Tel Sampler is just what we've been gradually using. It's a really simple sampler based on 90s type sampling, and it allows for a very quick and easy, fun way to get into sound.
So finally then, Nightports is based on a manifesto of restriction, and all the music we make is governed by this. Restriction and limitation are inescapable realities of all of our creative practice. We can only work with the people we know, the materials we have available to us, but the self-conscious adoption of such a manifesto is a reaction to and against technological affordances of our time. It's an attempt to cut through the saturation and ubiquity of software and sample sets, and it's an attempt to retrieve an individuality of sound through a very stringent control of process. In sum, it means that we have to explore the relationship between the poetics, the making of contemporary music production, and the resulting aesthetics. Thank you.
I'm finished with 30 seconds to go.
Perhaps.
Questions? I have a question to start things off. I mean, there's seats to come out. A lot of practice-based research often seems to focus on more contemporary or experimental or avant-garde approaches. Seems to be drawn that way. Do you think that's a natural process, or what do you think about that?
I find it hard to answer that question because my original musical training is very much in that mid-20th century avant-garde stuff with Boulez, Stockhausen, Cage, those sorts of things. So I find it hard to answer the general question about practice as research and sorts of mentalities because I'm rooted in that tradition anyway. But I imagine the impetus towards innovation, discovering new things, kind of aligns with what we should be doing as researchers as well. So when we set out to answer a research question, we're trying to answer a question which holds some new insight into something perhaps familiar or unknown completely. So by adopting those kinds of mentalities of experimentation, of unknown stuff and uncertainties, it's probably aligned with that quite fundamental desire as a researcher to discover something new, to provide some kind of new insight. And I suppose there's a natural, comfortable fit between those two sorts of mentalities, I imagine.
Anything to add?
Partly that this project came about and began before I worked in higher education, so its essence was maybe a reaction to what I'd learned in higher education when I was previously there, but it then has been applied as research practice later down the line. So I think the style thing was maybe we fall into the trap of researchers' practice stylistically, but it wasn't kind of intentional to meet that criteria.
I was just wondering if there's really prominent use of reverberation in the pieces, or at least it sounds like process reverberation. Is there any part of the manifesto that alludes to that in terms of the choices around the types of reverb and any, are they sort of symbolic or referential to any other factors?
No restrictions exist in the manifesto for that. It simply concerns sound source. But you don't inherit this sound from a recording musician without any of that kind of symbolic implication. So when Matt plays in a certain way or makes a piano sound like a 1980s dance TR-808 snare drum or something like that, it brings with it all these things that maybe I should try and find a plate reverb, or if he's playing romantically, maybe I should put him in a cathedral. So in fact, the manifesto doesn't restrict those kind of spatialization strategies, but the way the musician plays does, or at least it brings that kind of suggestion for the sorts of spaces you might put them. But what's quite important, and the window track, what was kind of trying to get at was that the spatial strategy is not a natural one. Initially it might seem like that, but when you listen in detail you realise that that piano cannot exist in all those spaces simultaneously, and it's that play of spatialisation which for me makes the construction of the track really interesting.
On the album we did with the vocalist, we did use convolution reverbs, but we started to have quite a lot of arguments about whether that was within the rules or not, so we've moved away from those now.
You go first.
Okay, I was just wondering about the musicians you're working with and their reaction to that. And I know you said that you kind of play the music back to them so they get an input at that stage. But are these musicians used to working in this way, in essence, as a sound source rather than as a composer? And I'm just wondering, in the sense of that you give them the opportunity to play over the top if they want to, how many of them take up that opportunity, or are they kind of happy to pass creative control over to you?
I think we've been quite wise in our choice of musicians. They're happy with whatever we do. So Matt's more than happy to sit in a room and just be recorded. And in fact, he said it was quite refreshing because many of his other projects, he's the composer, he plays a part in the production process, but he just got back to his piano playing improvisatory roots, and we're really happy to do that. But each of the musicians we're working with, they're well versed in studio production processes and studio recording, and they're really quite happy. When we send the music back to them, it's in a completely different form to the thing that they played. So it's almost like they're playing against somebody else's musicianship, if you like. And it's a really interesting feedback cycle as the years go on.
Time for one more quick question.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any restriction in terms of microphone choice as well, or whether you just sort of let the process guide that.
Only what we can get our hands on, I suppose.
Yeah.
No, in terms of production process, it's completely open, so we'll just choose whatever's most suitable for the content.
Okay. Yeah.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.